It was a sunny afternoon in Los Angeles when Clint Eastwood, dressed casually in a leather jacket and sunglasses, decided to pay a visit to a local motorcycle dealership. Clint had always been a fan of bikes, especially vintage models, and had spent years collecting and restoring them. He wasn't there for anything special, just browsing for a new project to work on. As he walked into the dealership, he immediately noticed the impressive collection of motorcycles displayed along the showroom floor. The sleek designs and shiny chrome caught his eye, but he wasn't there to make a quick purchase. Clint walked up to the nearest salesman, a young man who appeared to be in his mid-20s, and introduced himself with a friendly smile. "Hey there, I'm just looking around. I'm a big fan of these bikes," Clint said, his voice calm and warm. The salesman looked up and gave Clint a quick once-over, then smirked. He didn't recognize Clint immediately, assuming he was just another customer looking to buy a motorcycle. The salesman's attitude shifted when Clint mentioned his interest in some of the more rare, vintage models. "I don't think you can afford these," the salesman said, his tone dripping with condescension. Clint, taken aback by the remark, tried to remain calm. "I'm just looking for something unique," he replied, his eyes scanning the bikes. The salesman chuckled, leaning against the counter with a dismissive gesture. "Sure, whatever. But these are high-end bikes. People like you usually just waste their time here," the salesman said with a sneer. Clint felt a wave of frustration build up inside him, but he refused to let the young man's arrogance get to him. He continued to browse the bikes, taking his time to examine the details and craftsmanship of each one. But as Clint stepped closer to one of the vintage models, the salesman suddenly approached him aggressively. "I said, I don't think you can afford these," the salesman repeated, his voice louder this time. "Why don't you just leave before you embarrass yourself?" Clint stood there in shock, not just by the salesman's words but by the utter disrespect he was receiving. "Excuse me?" Clint said, his voice steady but firm. "I don't know who you think you're talking to, but you've crossed the line." The salesman, seemingly oblivious to the growing tension, simply shrugged and gestured toward the door. "I'm not wasting my time with someone who can't even afford the helmet for these bikes," he said with a smirk. Clint's patience was wearing thin, but he was determined not to make a scene. He turned to walk toward the exit, but just as he reached the door, the salesman delivered a final, humiliating blow. "Yeah, keep walking, old man. I'm sure you've got better things to do," he sneered. But before Clint could respond, the salesman stepped forward and slapped him across the back of the head, a move so out of line that it stunned everyone in the dealership. The slap echoed through the showroom, and Clint stood frozen for a moment, disbelief flashing across his face. The salespeople and customers who had been watching the exchange were silent, unsure of what to do. Clint turned around slowly, his expression hardening. He didn't say a word, but his eyes were filled with a quiet intensity that made the salesman suddenly regret his actions. Clint walked out of the dealership without another glance at the man who had humiliated him, the door slamming shut behind him. Outside, Clint took a deep breath, shaking off the frustration that had built up. But he wasn't going to let this go. This wasn't just about a slap, it was about respect, and he wasn't about to let someone get away with treating him, or anyone, like that. Clint called one of his trusted friends, a business associate who happened to be the owner of the dealership chain. He explained what had happened and told him exactly who was responsible. The next morning, Clint Eastwood returned to the dealership, but this time, things were going to be very different. He walked in with confidence, and as soon as he entered, the atmosphere in the showroom shifted. The young salesman was still there, unaware of the storm that was about to hit him. Clint walked directly up to him, his gaze cold and unwavering. "I'm back," Clint said simply. The salesman, realizing who he was now, started to stammer an apology. "Mr. Eastwood, I didn't," Clint raised his hand, silencing him. "I'm not here to listen to your excuses," Clint said, his voice calm but filled with authority. "I'm here to make sure you understand that your actions have consequences." The salesman's face went pale as Clint continued. "I don't care how you treat customers, but when you cross the line and disrespect someone like that, there are repercussions." Clint then turned to the dealership manager, who had rushed over to see what was going on. "I expect this employee to be fired," Clint said bluntly. "No one should ever be treated the way I was treated here." The manager, now fully aware of Clint's identity and the gravity of the situation, quickly agreed. The young salesman was escorted out of the dealership, and the entire store watched in stunned silence. Clint's actions sent a clear message that respect was non-negotiable. As Clint left the dealership, the employees knew that this was a lesson they wouldn't soon forget. If you've ever witnessed someone stand up for what's right, let us know where you're watching from in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon for more stories like this one.